The Cold War was never won by speeches, parades, or declarations broadcast to the world. It was decided far from cameras, in places where silence carried more weight than ideology, and where numbers spoke with brutal honesty. It was a conflict defined not by who shouted the loudest, but by who arrived first. First to imagine, first to design, first to build, and first to master systems so advanced that their very existence reshaped what power meant. Long before the Cold War had a name, long before the world divided into rival blocs, the United States had already begun laying the foundations of a technological dominance that would later feel unstoppable. That dominance did not emerge suddenly with supersonic jets or orbiting satellites. It emerged earlier, quieter, and far more decisively. For the American public, the Cold War often appeared as a dramatic standoff between equals, two superpowers locked in a race where victory seemed uncertain until the very end. But inside Soviet design bureaus, intelligence directorates, and strategic planning rooms, a different understanding slowly took hold. This was not a race that began in 1947. It was a continuation of something older, something the United States had already learned how to do exceptionally well: transform scientific insight into operational power, and operational power into strategic inevitability. The realization was deeply unsettling because it suggested that no amount of effort, no surge in production, no ideological resolve could erase a disadvantage that was not merely technological, but structural. The Soviet Union could build fast aircraft. It could build powerful engines. It could produce weapons in enormous quantities. What it struggled to replicate was the American ability to unify all of those elements into a single, coherent system that worked immediately, reliably, and at scale. That gap, subtle, invisible to the public, yet painfully obvious to those forced to confront it, became one of the defining humiliations of the Cold War. Among the many artifacts studied by Soviet analysts searching for the roots of American superiority, one stood out in a way that was impossible to ignore. It did not belong to the jet age. It did not rely on missiles, computers, or stealth coatings. It came from an earlier war, powered by piston engines and propellers. And yet, it embodied principles that would dominate Cold War air doctrine decades later. That aircraft was the P-38 Lightning. To dismiss the P-38 as merely a successful fighter of the Second World War was to miss the point entirely. For Soviet engineers examining the historical record, the Lightning represented an anomaly, a machine that appeared before the theoretical framework existed to explain how it should have been possible. It integrated speed, altitude, range, firepower, and stability in a way that Soviet aviation philosophy would not fully embrace until much later. Worse still, it had done so without compromise. The P-38 was not exceptional in one dimension while flawed in others. It worked as a whole. This was the first blow to Soviet confidence, though it was never acknowledged publicly. The Lightning had been conceived and deployed at a time when the Soviet Union was still struggling to reconcile its own industrial ambitions with the realities of advanced aeronautical engineering. While Soviet designs often chased singular performance metrics, tighter turning radius, heavier armament, or higher climb rate, the American approach emphasized balance. The P-38 was not designed to win a contest of agility. It was designed to control the engagement itself. That distinction would later become central to Cold War air combat, but the Americans had already learned it the hard way and then perfected it. As Cold War tensions intensified, Soviet analysts revisiting the Lightning began to recognize a deeply uncomfortable pattern. Every new American breakthrough seemed less like a leap forward and more like a natural extension of earlier work. The technologies that defined American air dominance during the Cold War did not appear isolated or experimental. They followed a clear lineage. The P-38 stood at the beginning of that line, not as a curiosity, but as proof that the United States had learned how to think several steps ahead. This realization carried profound psychological weight. In the Soviet system, progress was often framed as heroic struggle, overcoming limitations through effort, sacrifice, and ideological commitment. The lightning suggested something far more troubling. It implied that American dominance was not born of desperation or reaction, but of confidence. The P-38 did not exist because the United States feared falling behind. It existed because American engineers were given the freedom, resources, and trust to solve problems before they became urgent. During the Cold War, as Soviet interceptors strained to match the altitude and speed of American reconnaissance platforms, the echoes of that earlier imbalance grew louder. The Lightning had demonstrated decades earlier that altitude was not merely a performance metric, but a form of control. From above, one dictated the terms of engagement. From above, one could strike or withdraw at will. From above, one denied the enemy the ability to respond. This philosophy did not fade with propellers. It evolved. And the Soviet Union found itself perpetually responding to threats that had already matured. What made this especially humiliating was that the P-38 had not been hidden. Its achievements were documented. Its capabilities were known. And yet, the implications had not been fully grasped until it was too late. In the Cold War, Soviet planners were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Americans were not improvising superiority. They were refining it. The same mindset that had produced the Lightning now produced aircraft that could cross continents without interception, operate at the edge of space, and gather intelligence with impunity. In private assessments, Soviet experts acknowledged the difficulty of bridging this gap. Even when technical parity was achieved in isolated areas, the integration lagged behind. Engines improved, but reliability suffered. Airframes advanced, but production consistency faltered. Avionics matured, but training pipelines strained. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to move forward in lockstep. Design informed production. Production informed training. Training informed doctrine. Doctrine fed back into design. It was a self-reinforcing system, and the P-38 was one of its earliest, clearest expressions. The humiliation of the Cold War did not come from defeat in battle. It came from the slow, grinding recognition that the contest had been uneven from the start. That recognition was never spoken aloud in public forums, but it shaped decisions at every level. It drove frantic efforts to close gaps that kept widening. It fostered a constant sense of urgency that American planners, secure in their foundations, did not share. And at the center of that realization stood a machine from another era, not as a relic, but as a warning. The P-38 Lightning was not important because it won fights. It was important because it revealed a way of thinking about power that the United States would never abandon. A way of thinking that turned technology into leverage, leverage into control, and control into inevitability. As the Cold War solidified into a permanent condition rather than a temporary standoff, Soviet planners began to recognize that their greatest challenge was not any single American weapon, but the pattern behind them. Each year brought new data, new intelligence, new observations that were difficult to reconcile with the official narrative of technological convergence. On paper, the gap was supposed to be closing. In reality, it seemed to reappear in different forms, always at the moment when parity appeared within reach. The uncomfortable truth was that American superiority was not episodic. It was cumulative. This realization carried a distinct psychological weight inside Soviet institutions. Engineers were trained to solve problems. Strategists were trained to counter threats. But what they faced was neither a discrete problem nor a single threat. It was a system that produced advantages faster than they could be neutralized. When analysts traced this system backward, searching for its origins, they encountered this same evidence again and again. Long before jet engines redefined air combat, the United States had already demonstrated a mastery of integration that others had not yet learned to value. The P-38 Lightning stood as one of the clearest expressions of that mastery. What disturbed Soviet experts was not simply that the Lightning had been effective, but that it had functioned exactly as intended from the outset. It had not required endless revisions to become operationally viable. It had not been rushed into service to satisfy political demands. It had emerged from a design philosophy that prioritized coherence over spectacle. Every component served a role within a larger framework. Engines, aerodynamics, armament, and mission profile were treated not as independent variables, but as elements of a single equation. During the Cold War, this approach became increasingly rare outside the United States. As Soviet programs expanded in scale and ambition, the absence of this cohesion became more pronounced. New aircraft pushed performance boundaries, but often at the cost of reliability. Extraordinary capabilities were achieved in controlled conditions, yet proved difficult to sustain across fleets and theaters. Meanwhile, American systems appeared almost conservative on the surface, yet delivered consistent results under operational stress. This contrast was deeply unsettling. It suggested that American confidence did not rest on isolated breakthroughs, but on a mature process that transformed innovation into dependable power. The P-38, when viewed through this lens, was no longer merely a historical artifact. It became a diagnostic tool. By examining how and why it worked, Soviet analysts confronted a broader problem. The American advantage was not something that could be stolen or copied. It had to be grown. And growth required conditions that could not be manufactured overnight. Freedom to experiment, tolerance for failure, collaboration across disciplines, the patience to refine ideas until they were ready, rather than deploying them prematurely. During the Cold War, this realization manifested as a quiet but persistent anxiety. Each time American aircraft appeared capable of operating beyond Soviet reach, the question resurfaced: how long had they been preparing for this? The Lightning suggested an answer that was deeply uncomfortable. They had been preparing long before the confrontation began. The Cold War, in that sense, was not the beginning of American technological dominance. It was merely the phase in which that dominance became impossible to ignore. As the ideological conflict deepened, the lessons embedded in the P-38 evolved into doctrine, shaping the American approach to air power in ways that Soviet planners found increasingly difficult to counter. The emphasis shifted away from direct confrontation and toward control of the environment itself. Speed was not valued for its own sake, but for what it enabled. Altitude was not a challenge to be met, but an advantage to be held. Range was not about distance, but about denying the enemy safe spaces. These principles, first demonstrated in an earlier war, became central to American thinking throughout the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, this created a persistent strategic dilemma. Defensive systems multiplied, yet the sense of vulnerability remained. Interceptors grew faster, but the targets they were meant to catch seemed to operate just beyond their effective envelope. Radar coverage expanded, yet gaps persisted where American platforms appeared briefly and then vanished. Each new layer of defense exposed the need for another. The P-38 had illustrated this problem decades earlier by showing that dominance came not from meeting the enemy head-on, but from redefining the terms of engagement. This approach had profound psychological consequences. Soviet doctrine traditionally emphasized resilience and endurance. The assumption was that any conflict could be absorbed, contested, and eventually balanced through determination and scale. American air power challenged this assumption at its core. By operating where interception was impractical or impossible, it undermined the very idea of mutual contest. The enemy could be observed, measured, and pressured without ever offering a clear opportunity for response. This was not merely a technical problem. It was an existential one. The continuity between the Lightning and later American platforms became increasingly obvious to those forced to study it. The same logic appeared again and again. Enter the battle space with advantages already secured. Strike if necessary, and disengage at will. This pattern denied the adversary not only victory, but agency. In the Cold War, agency mattered as much as capability. To be unable to force a confrontation was to accept a subordinate position, regardless of ideology or rhetoric. For American planners, this continuity reinforced confidence. They did not see themselves as reacting to Soviet advances, but as extending an established trajectory. Each new system was treated as an evolution, not a gamble. The P-38 had been one of the earliest proofs that such an approach worked. It demonstrated that when technology, training, and doctrine advanced together, superiority became self-sustaining. During the Cold War, this lesson was applied relentlessly. For the Soviet Union, the effect was cumulative and corrosive. Each attempt to close the gap required greater effort and yielded diminishing returns. Progress was achieved, but it never stabilized. The sense of always arriving late shaped strategic thinking in subtle ways, encouraging caution where confidence was needed and haste where patience would have served better. The Lightning, long retired, continued to exert influence precisely because it embodied the origin of this imbalance. By the time the Cold War reached its most dangerous moments, the psychological terrain had already been shaped. The United States operated with the assurance of a system that trusted its own foundations. The Soviet Union operated under the pressure of a system that knew it was compensating. This difference, more than any single weapon, defined the outcome of the struggle. And at the root of that difference lay an early demonstration of what integrated technological power could achieve, a demonstration written into the history of the P-38 Lightning. As the Cold War entered its most competitive phase, the psychological pressure created by this imbalance began to shape Soviet decision-making in tangible ways. No longer confined to academic analysis or historical comparison, the awareness of American systemic advantage forced difficult choices. Programs were accelerated before their technologies were mature. Performance targets were raised beyond what existing industrial processes could reliably sustain. Design compromises were accepted not because they were optimal, but because delay itself had become intolerable. Each of these choices carried risk, and over time, those risks compounded. The contrast with the American approach could not have been sharper. While Soviet planners felt trapped by the urgency of catching up, American institutions operated with a sense of temporal control. Development timelines were long, deliberate, and insulated from political spectacle. Failures were addressed quietly. Iterations were absorbed into the process rather than treated as setbacks. This calm confidence was not accidental. It was the product of an ecosystem that had learned early on how to convert technological ambition into dependable capability. The P-38 Lightning had been one of the first aircraft to emerge fully formed from such an ecosystem, and its legacy could still be felt. Inside the Soviet system, the consequences of this disparity were increasingly difficult to conceal. Aircraft entered service with impressive headline specifications but limited operational margins. Maintenance demands rose. Accident rates became a concern. Training pipelines struggled to keep pace with the complexity of new platforms. Each issue, taken alone, could be rationalized. Together, they pointed to a deeper problem. The system was being pushed faster than it could stabilize. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to expand capability without sacrificing reliability, reinforcing the perception that their advantage was not merely technological, but organizational. This realization intensified the psychological strain. Soviet leaders understood that numbers alone could not solve the problem. Producing more aircraft did not guarantee control of the air. Building faster interceptors did not ensure successful interception. What mattered was the coherence of the entire structure, from concept to deployment. The Lightning had demonstrated this coherence decades earlier. Its success had not depended on perfect conditions or heroic improvisation. It had depended on balance, foresight, and an industrial culture capable of sustaining excellence under pressure. As Cold War confrontations multiplied, this imbalance manifested repeatedly. American forces demonstrated an ability to operate globally with consistency, projecting power without exposing themselves to decisive counteraction. Soviet defenses responded, adapted, and expanded, yet always with the sense that they were reacting to an initiative they did not control. This asymmetry eroded confidence over time. Even moments of apparent parity carried an underlying tension, an awareness that the margin was fragile and likely temporary. The humiliation embedded in this dynamic was subtle but persistent. It did not announce itself through defeat. It emerged through comparison, through the realization that American systems matured predictably, while Soviet systems matured under duress. The Lightning's legacy made this comparison unavoidable. It stood as early proof that American air power had been built on principles that resisted obsolescence. Those principles continued to yield results, even as technology advanced and contexts changed. As this pressure mounted, Soviet doctrine itself began to change in subtle but revealing ways. What had once been framed as confidence gradually shifted toward caution and then toward restraint. Engagement rules were rewritten. Risk tolerance narrowed. Scenarios that assumed decisive interception were quietly downgraded in probability. This was not an admission of inferiority. It was an adaptation to reality. The leadership understood that confronting American systems head-on often produced outcomes that could not be controlled. The safer option was to avoid direct confrontation altogether, to rely on deterrence rather than contest. This shift carried its own psychological cost. A military culture that had long celebrated resilience and endurance found itself constrained by uncertainty. Pilots trained extensively yet understood that many engagements would be fought at the margins, if at all. Engineers produced increasingly complex machines while knowing that complexity itself introduced fragility. Strategists planned defenses layered upon defenses, fully aware that each new layer acknowledged the existence of gaps beneath it. The Cold War became less about proving strength and more about managing vulnerability. The American posture, by contrast, projected calm inevitability. Systems were fielded with the expectation that they would function across a wide range of conditions, not merely under ideal circumstances. Training emphasized discipline over improvisation, preparation over reaction. This confidence was rooted in continuity. The same institutional logic that had produced the P-38 Lightning now governed decision-making at every level. Problems were anticipated, not chased. Solutions were integrated, not patched together. From the Soviet perspective, this created a form of strategic paralysis. Each attempt to mirror American capabilities required enormous investment, yet success was never complete. Even when a new platform appeared promising, it arrived into an environment already reshaped by American advancements. The Lightning had introduced the idea that air power was about controlling the geometry of conflict. The Cold War expanded that idea into the control of time, space, and information. The United States consistently occupied positions that forced the Soviet Union to respond rather than initiate. This imbalance influenced resource allocation in profound ways. Funds were diverted toward emergency programs. Long-term research was sacrificed to meet immediate requirements. The result was a cycle that reinforced itself. Urgency bred compromise. Compromise bred instability, and instability demanded further urgency. The Americans, insulated by their established base, avoided this trap. Their development cycles absorbed setbacks without collapsing, preserving momentum even in the face of failure. The humiliation embedded in this process was never theatrical. It unfolded slowly through spreadsheets, test reports, and readiness assessments. Soviet planners understood that their efforts were heroic, often brilliant, yet constrained by a system that demanded results faster than they could be reliably delivered. The Lightning's shadow loomed large here, not because of its age, but because of what it represented. It was evidence that the Americans had learned, early on, how to let systems mature before relying on them absolutely. As years passed, this realization shaped strategic behavior. Avoidance replaced engagement. Prediction replaced confrontation. The Cold War stabilized not because the gap closed, but because it became too dangerous to test directly. The United States operated from a position of structural confidence, while the Soviet Union managed a position of perpetual adjustment. This difference did not require public acknowledgement. It was understood implicitly by those who mattered most. As these internal pressures accumulated, their effects began to radiate outward, shaping Soviet behavior on the global stage. The Cold War was no longer fought solely in laboratories, design bureaus, or classified briefing rooms. It unfolded in alliances, postures, and carefully measured displays of strength. Here, too, the imbalance made itself felt. Soviet commitments abroad became increasingly defensive in character, framed around deterrence and presence rather than decisive control. The ambition to dominate airspace beyond immediate borders gave way to the priority of denying access, a subtle but telling shift in strategic confidence. American power projection, by contrast, carried an unmistakable sense of assurance. Aircraft operated far from home bases with reliability that appeared routine rather than exceptional. Exercises with allies demonstrated not just capability, but predictability. The message was implicit. American systems worked not only in theory, but consistently across climates, distances, and political contexts. This consistency mattered. It reassured partners and unsettled adversaries. For Soviet observers, it reinforced the uncomfortable truth that the United States was not improvising its dominance. It was executing it. The lineage of this confidence could be traced backward. The same philosophy that had produced the P-38 Lightning, an aircraft designed to control the fight, rather than merely survive it, now informed global strategy. Reach mattered more than proximity. Endurance mattered more than spectacle. The ability to arrive, operate, and withdraw on one's own terms defined credibility. Soviet planners recognized this dynamic with growing clarity, even as public rhetoric continued to emphasize balance and equivalence. In proxy regions, this difference became stark. Where American-backed forces enjoyed air cover that could appear with little warning and remain with persistence, Soviet-aligned forces often depended on rigid schedules and limited windows of effectiveness. This asymmetry shaped outcomes without requiring direct confrontation between the superpowers. The side that could sustain presence dictated tempo. The side that reacted operated under constraint. Over time, this pattern eroded the perception of Soviet reliability among partners who measured strength not by declarations but by results. The psychological weight of this erosion was profound. Influence depends on confidence, and confidence depends on predictability. As Soviet systems struggled to deliver consistent performance beyond carefully controlled environments, doubts grew quietly among those who relied on them. American air power, rooted in decades of integrated development, continued to signal stability. The Lightning's legacy echoed here as well. It had demonstrated that when technology is built as part of a coherent system, its influence extends far beyond its immediate role. For the Soviet Union, the global implications of this reality were difficult to confront. Each commitment carried risk. Each deployment invited comparison. The safest course increasingly became restraint, selective engagement, and reliance on deterrence rather than demonstration. This posture reduced the chance of humiliation, but it also limited opportunity. The Cold War's geography became shaped not just by ideology, but by the invisible boundaries of technological confidence. American planners understood this intuitively. They did not need to provoke. Presence alone was often sufficient. The knowledge that American systems could appear where expected and where unexpected altered calculations everywhere. The advantage lay not in confrontation, but in anticipation. This, too, had been foreshadowed by the Lightning, an aircraft that had taught an earlier generation that control of altitude and timing could determine outcomes before the first shot was fired. By the later stages of the Cold War, the pattern was well established. The Soviet Union remained formidable, capable, and resilient. Yet it operated within constraints shaped by an awareness of systemic disadvantage. The United States, drawing on a deep foundation of integrated technological power, moved with confidence across the global chessboard. The imbalance was rarely acknowledged aloud. It did not need to be. It was visible in behavior, in choices made and avoided, in the quiet acceptance of limits that could not be easily overcome. By the time the Cold War reached its later decades, the imbalance that had once seemed abstract had hardened into something closer to inevitability. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union could match individual American technologies, but whether it could ever escape the cycle of reaction that defined its strategic posture. Each new initiative was framed by awareness of what already existed on the other side. Each decision carried the weight of comparison. This persistent asymmetry reshaped not only military planning, but institutional psychology. American air power continued to evolve along a trajectory that appeared almost effortless from the outside. New platforms emerged not as desperate leaps, but as extensions of an established logic. Capabilities layered upon capabilities. Reach expanded while reliability remained intact. The system absorbed complexity without collapsing under its weight. This ability to grow without destabilizing itself became one of the most demoralizing aspects for Soviet observers. It suggested that American dominance was not brittle. It was resilient. The P-38 Lightning, long removed from operational relevance, retained symbolic power precisely because it revealed how early this pattern had been set. It demonstrated that American superiority was not a Cold War improvisation, but the result of habits formed generations earlier. Integration, patience, and foresight had been embedded into the structure of development. The Soviet system, by contrast, had been optimized for urgency. It excelled at producing results quickly under pressure, but struggled to sustain equilibrium over time. As economic strain increased, these differences became harder to manage. Resources were finite. Trade-offs grew sharper. The cost of maintaining parity across every domain became unsustainable. Strategic choices narrowed. Soviet leadership increasingly prioritized internal stability over external projection, recognizing that overextension carried unacceptable risk. This recalibration was pragmatic, but it also marked an implicit acknowledgement of limits that ideology alone could not overcome. Meanwhile, American confidence deepened. The absence of crisis allowed long-term planning to flourish. Institutions refined processes rather than reinventing them. Training, doctrine, and technology advanced in concert. This harmony created a feedback loop in which success reinforced confidence, and confidence enabled further success. The Lightning's legacy lived on here as well, not in metal or speed, but in method. For those within the Soviet system, the realization was sobering. Effort was not lacking. Talent was not lacking. Courage was not lacking. What was missing was the environment that allowed innovation to mature without distortion. The Cold War had exposed this deficiency relentlessly. Each comparison with American capability served as a reminder that systemic advantages cannot be willed into existence. They must be cultivated patiently, over time, within structures that reward coherence rather than haste. As the confrontation edged toward its conclusion, the outcome felt less like defeat and more like exhaustion. The contest had been fought not only across borders, but across decades. In that long struggle, the United States had benefited from continuity. The Soviet Union had borne the cost of perpetual acceleration. The difference shaped everything that followed. The Lightning, in retrospect, appears less as an isolated triumph and more as a signal event. It announced the arrival of a way of thinking that would dominate the air and later the strategic imagination itself. From that moment onward, American power would increasingly be defined by its ability to arrive prepared, to operate beyond reach, and to leave nothing to chance. The Cold War merely confirmed what that aircraft had already implied. As the Cold War approached its final years, the long arc of comparison reached a quiet conclusion. There was no single moment of collapse, no dramatic admission of defeat etched into official doctrine. Instead, the outcome revealed itself through absence. The absence of initiative, the absence of confidence, the absence of belief that another surge of effort could finally reverse the imbalance. What remained was the recognition that the contest had been decided not by one breakthrough, but by an accumulation of advantages patiently built and carefully preserved. American air power stood as one of the clearest symbols of this reality. Its dominance no longer needed to be demonstrated. It was assumed. Allies planned around it. Adversaries planned to avoid it. The ability to project force, gather information, and withdraw without meaningful interference had become normalized. This normalization was itself the ultimate expression of superiority. What once would have been extraordinary now appeared routine, reinforcing the perception that American systems were not exceptional because of spectacle, but because of reliability. For Soviet institutions, this normalization was deeply unsettling. It forced a reckoning with limits that could no longer be deferred. The economic and organizational strain of perpetual competition had reached a breaking point. Maintaining the appearance of parity required ever greater sacrifices while delivering diminishing strategic returns. The realization emerged slowly but unmistakably. The system could continue reacting, but it could no longer lead. The lineage of this outcome traced back farther than most were willing to admit. Long before the ideological confrontation crystallized, the United States had already demonstrated a capacity to integrate technology, doctrine, and industry into a cohesive whole. The P-38 Lightning had been one of the earliest manifestations of this capacity. It showed that dominance was not a matter of isolated brilliance, but of structural alignment. That lesson, once learned, was never forgotten. As the Cold War wound down, the silence surrounding these comparisons grew heavier. There was little appetite for revisiting the origins of the imbalance. Doing so would have required acknowledging that the gap was not simply the result of late-stage divergence, but of foundational differences present from the start. For the Soviet Union, this acknowledgement carried implications that extended far beyond military affairs. For the United States, the end of the Cold War validated a long-held confidence. The victory was not celebrated as a conquest, but accepted as the natural conclusion of a sustained effort. The systems that had been built endured. The habits that had been cultivated remained intact. The principles that had guided development from the era of the Lightning onward continued to shape strategy in a new world. The P-38 itself faded into history, preserved in museums and memory, yet its influence persisted. It represented the moment when American air power chose a path defined by foresight rather than reaction. That choice echoed across decades, shaping outcomes that its designers could scarcely have imagined. In the final accounting, the Cold War was less a sudden triumph than a confirmation. A confirmation that when technological ambition is aligned with patience, discipline, and systemic coherence, superiority becomes inevitable. This realization closed the psychological loop that had begun decades earlier. The Lightning had announced a way of thinking. The Cold War had tested it. History had rendered its verdict. As the Cold War progressed, it became increasingly clear that technology alone was not the decisive advantage. The true weapon was the industrial and organizational ecosystem that stood behind it. American power did not surge forward in bursts. It advanced steadily, predictably, almost indifferently. New systems entered service not as desperate answers, but as natural extensions of an existing framework. Production scaled without destabilization. Maintenance networks absorbed complexity. Training pipelines expanded alongside technological sophistication. The system did not strain under progress. It normalized it. For Soviet planners, this was profoundly destabilizing. Their own industrial base was immense, but rigid, centralized, and politically entangled. Every adjustment required approval. Every deviation carried risk. Innovation moved vertically, not laterally. By contrast, American industry appeared disturbingly fluid. Decisions were distributed. Feedback loops were short. Failures were corrected locally before becoming systemic. The P-38 Lightning had already demonstrated this advantage decades earlier. Not merely advanced, but producible, sustainable, and adaptable at scale. During the Cold War, This same industrial philosophy repeatedly produced systems that the Soviet Union could observe in detail, yet never fully replicate in function. The humiliation embedded in this disparity was not emotional, it was statistical. American production curves remained stable while capability increased. Soviet curves surged and stalled. Programs launched with urgency often reached operational service before they were mature, forcing compromises that accumulated over time. Each Soviet success arrived into an environment already shaped by American continuity. The race was never reset. It only extended. The psychological toll of this imbalance on Soviet planners cannot be overstated. Over time, confidence gave way to calculation, calculation to caution, and caution to anxiety. Strategic decisions were no longer framed around what could be achieved, but around what risks could be avoided. Unknown margins became more frightening than known deficiencies. The possibility that American systems possessed unseen capabilities, already operational, already integrated, haunted every planning session. American planners benefited enormously from this asymmetry. Their decisions were made from a position of choice rather than constraint. Programs could be delayed, refined, or quietly restructured without fear of exposure. This freedom bred institutional calm. Calm enabled precision. Precision preserved dominance. The P-38 Lightning had first introduced this psychological advantage by proving that control of the engagement mattered more than participation in it. During the Cold War, this lesson expanded into doctrine across every domain. Within the Soviet system, this constant state of reaction produced internal friction. Innovation became politicized. Failure became dangerous. Engineers learned to protect themselves rather than challenge assumptions. Over time, this eroded the very creativity required to close the gap. The humiliation here was invisible to the public, but devastating to those inside the system who understood what was being sacrificed. By the middle decades of the Cold War, it was increasingly clear that the rivalry was not producing convergence, but divergence. American power evolved through refinement. Soviet power evolved through acceleration. One system valued balance and longevity. The other valued urgency and output. This difference defined everything that followed. The P-38 Lightning's relevance to this realization was not symbolic. It was diagnostic. It proved that American dominance was not a product of late-stage technological luck, but of habits formed early. Those habits shaped institutions, expectations, and decision-making structures. The Cold War did not create American superiority. It merely revealed how deeply rooted it already was. For American audiences, this truth carries quiet pride. Victory did not depend on singular genius or dramatic breakthroughs. It depended on patience, coherence, and trust in systems rather than shortcuts. For Soviet planners, the same truth carried resignation. The contest had never been unfair. It had simply been asymmetrical from the beginning. The most devastating humiliation of all was silence. There were no declarations acknowledging defeat in technological philosophy, no official admissions that the gap was structural. Instead, silence replaced ambition. Programs were quietly canceled. Objectives were subtly reduced. Expectations were revised downward without explanation. The absence of bold announcements spoke louder than any confession. American dominance required no celebration. It expressed itself through normalcy, through the routine operation of power, through the absence of challenge. The Lightning had once denied opponents the ability to fight on equal terms. The Cold War reproduced this dynamic at strategic scale, where denial replaced confrontation as the defining experience. In silence, acknowledgement lived, and in silence it endured. The P-38 Lightning ultimately transcended its role as an aircraft. It became a symbol of a philosophy that reshaped warfare itself. It represented the moment when American air power chose integration over improvisation, patience over urgency, systems over spectacle. That choice echoed across decades, shaping technologies and doctrines far removed from its original context. To study the Lightning during the Cold War was to confront an uncomfortable reality. The future had already been rehearsed. The Soviet Union could build formidable machines, but it struggled to build environments where power could mature without distortion. The Lightning stood as proof that superiority is not achieved by chasing the present, but by defining it. In the end, the Cold War did not conclude with a decisive aerial confrontation. It ended with acceptance. Acceptance that the struggle had been decided not by isolated moments, but by sustained coherence across generations. The United States had learned early how to align technology, industry, doctrine, and psychology into a single, self-reinforcing structure. The P-38 Lightning was one of the first clear signals of that alignment. The Cold War did not create American dominance, it exposed it. The Lightning announced it. History confirmed it, slowly, relentlessly, and without mercy. As the Cold War solidified into a permanent condition rather than a temporary standoff, Soviet planners began to recognize that their greatest challenge was not any single American weapon, but the pattern behind them. Each year brought new data, new intelligence, new observations that were difficult to reconcile with the official narrative of technological convergence. On paper, the gap was supposed to be closing. In reality, it seemed to reappear in different forms, always at the moment when parity appeared within reach. The uncomfortable truth was that American superiority was not episodic. It was cumulative. This realization carried a distinct psychological weight inside Soviet institutions. Engineers were trained to solve problems. Strategists were trained to counter threats. But what they faced was neither a discrete problem nor a single threat. It was a system that produced advantages faster than they could be neutralized. When analysts traced this system backward, searching for its origins, they encountered this same evidence again and again. Long before jet engines redefined air combat, the United States had already demonstrated a mastery of integration that others had not yet learned to value. The P-38 Lightning stood as one of the clearest expressions of that mastery. What disturbed Soviet experts was not simply that the Lightning had been effective, but that it had functioned exactly as intended from the outset. It had not required endless revisions to become operationally viable. It had not been rushed into service to satisfy political demands. It had emerged from a design philosophy that prioritized coherence over spectacle. Every component served a role within a larger framework. Engines, aerodynamics, armament, and mission profile were treated not as independent variables, but as elements of a single equation. During the Cold War, this approach became increasingly rare outside the United States. As Soviet programs expanded in scale and ambition, the absence of this cohesion became more pronounced. New aircraft pushed performance boundaries, but often at the cost of reliability. Extraordinary capabilities were achieved in controlled conditions, yet proved difficult to sustain across fleets and theaters. Meanwhile, American systems appeared almost conservative on the surface, yet delivered consistent results under operational stress. This contrast was deeply unsettling. It suggested that American confidence did not rest on isolated breakthroughs, but on a mature process that transformed innovation into dependable power. The P-38, when viewed through this lens, was no longer merely a historical artifact. It became a diagnostic tool. By examining how and why it worked, Soviet analysts confronted a broader problem. The American advantage was not something that could be stolen or copied. It had to be grown. And growth required conditions that could not be manufactured overnight. Freedom to experiment, tolerance for failure, collaboration across disciplines, the patience to refine ideas until they were ready, rather than deploying them prematurely. As the ideological conflict deepened, the lessons embedded in the P-38 evolved into doctrine, shaping the American approach to air power in ways that Soviet planners found increasingly difficult to counter. Speed was not valued for its own sake, but for what it enabled. Altitude was not a challenge to be met, but an advantage to be held. Range was not about distance, but about denying the enemy safe spaces. These principles, first demonstrated in an earlier war, became central to American thinking throughout the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, this created a persistent strategic dilemma. Defensive systems multiplied, yet the sense of vulnerability remained. Interceptors grew faster, but the targets they were meant to catch seemed to operate just beyond their effective envelope. Radar coverage expanded, yet gaps persisted where American platforms appeared briefly and then vanished. Each new layer of defense exposed the need for another. The Lightning had illustrated this problem decades earlier by showing that dominance came not from meeting the enemy head-on, but from redefining the terms of engagement. As the Cold War entered its most competitive phase, this imbalance began to shape Soviet decision-making in tangible ways. Programs were accelerated before technologies were mature. Performance targets were raised beyond what industrial processes could reliably sustain. Design compromises were accepted not because they were optimal, but because delay itself had become intolerable. Each choice carried risk, and over time, those risks compounded. The contrast with the American approach could not have been sharper. Development timelines were long, deliberate, and insulated from political spectacle. Failures were absorbed quietly. Iterations strengthened systems rather than undermining them. This calm confidence was not accidental. It was the product of an ecosystem that had learned how to convert technological ambition into dependable capability. The P-38 Lightning had been one of the first aircraft to emerge fully formed from such an ecosystem, and its legacy remained visible decades later. As internal pressures accumulated, their effects radiated outward, shaping Soviet behavior on the global stage. Commitments abroad became defensive rather than decisive. The ambition to dominate airspace beyond immediate borders gave way to denial strategies. American power projection, by contrast, carried assurance. Aircraft operated far from home bases with reliability that appeared routine. Exercises demonstrated not just strength, but predictability. Presence alone altered calculations. By the later decades of the Cold War, the imbalance hardened into inevitability. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union could match individual technologies, but whether it could escape the cycle of reaction that defined its posture. American systems grew without destabilizing themselves. Soviet systems advanced under pressure. One side extended an established trajectory. The other chased it. As economic strain mounted, resources narrowed, and choices sharpened. The cost of maintaining parity across every domain became unsustainable. Strategic focus turned inward. Stability replaced ambition. Meanwhile, American institutions refined what already worked. Training, doctrine, and technology advanced together. This harmony reinforced confidence and produced momentum that no single program could disrupt. As the Cold War approached its final years, the outcome revealed itself through absence. The absence of initiative. The absence of belief that another surge could reverse the imbalance. American air power no longer needed demonstration. It was assumed. Allies planned around it. Adversaries planned to avoid it. That normalization was the ultimate expression of dominance. The lineage of this result extended farther back than most were willing to admit. Long before the ideological confrontation, the United States had already chosen a path defined by foresight rather than reaction. The P-38 Lightning had been one of the earliest manifestations of that choice. It showed that superiority was not the result of improvisation, but of alignment between technology, doctrine, and industry. The Cold War did not create American dominance, it revealed it. The Lightning announced it. History confirmed it.